thanks, Anne Marie, and I want to thank Cornerstone, too, for their leadership here in New Hampshire. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening, and it's a pleasure to be with these folks who we've been working with across the country against Common Core. So I'm going to just take a quick couple minutes to explain what Common Core is. Common Core is a set of English and math standards that were developed by the Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers, which is the commissioners of education for each state. Most of the funding for the development of the standards was paid for by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So for the last 20 some odd years or so, there's been a lot of advocates for national standards, and I'll talk a little bit more about how and the way we got to this situation. But there's a lot of folks in Washington, D.C., these education trade organizations. They're non-governmental organizations, they're private organizations that are driven by taxpayers' dollars and membership fees, as well as some corporate contributions. But they, for a long time, have believed that the remedy for the struggles in K-12 education in this country is to have a uniform, nationalized, top-down, one-size-fits-all approach. But given the fact that it is Constitution Day, I'm going to articulate a little bit why that's not a particularly good idea. So first of all, the Founding Fathers, I think, were very wise. They studied history and philosophy from every era, from antiquity to their own times, and understood well these issues of federalism, which is the federal government and centralized authority has certain responsibilities and rights, and the states have certain responsibilities and rights. And in the founders' vision of the United States, the national government can handle defense and trade and foreign policy and these kind of matters, but most domestic matters, in particular education, really they left up to the states. In fact, the U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, and that's not an accident. Whereas the state constitutions are very, very specific about it, and I'll just use a couple of examples. So Massachusetts, your neighbor to the south, the Constitution was written by John Adams, drafted in 1779, 1780, and there's several paragraphs that talk in a lot of very detailed articulations of what education should look like. It's called the Cherish Clause. There's a particular paragraph that talks about cherishing the interests of literature and mathematics and science, and that it's the interest and responsibility, and in fact duty, of state legislators and public officials to cherish and promote these things and pass them on to posterity. It's equally true in Virginia. The Virginia state constitution, which was worked on by Thomas Jefferson and George Mason and others, also has lots of very clear articulations about state responsibilities and local responsibilities to uphold elementary education and secondary education as a means for perpetuating our democracy. This mechanism, this local mechanism, is really was what the founders thought was the wellspring of our way of life. And that, generally speaking, has served the country quite well. I mean, we went from essentially a collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to the most powerful country in the world in a remarkably short period of time. And it was that wellspring of locally funded, locally controlled, oftentimes parent and town-controlled approaches to education that was the catapult for this enormous success of our country. But in truth, by the 70s and certainly the early 80s, public education, by all accounts, had fallen into disrepair. There was a report that was released by a commission that Ronald Reagan had commissioned in 1983. It just celebrated its 30th anniversary. It's called A Nation at Risk. And what it said was, in comparison to our international competitors in Germany, Japan, and Far Eastern nations, that we were falling behind. We had once enjoyed a very lofty kind of position in terms of international competitiveness, but we'd fallen to about 25th or something in terms of a lot of international measures. But what they didn't do, and what that commission didn't do, was prescribe a lot of top-down solutions to solve these problems, because they knew that there is not only a long legal and financial commitment at the state and local level for public education, but that if you divest parents and people at the local level from the decision-making around their children and the rearing of their children, that you're stripping them the most fundamental right that our society can bestow. And so there were a variety of different measures to try to reform public education. Milton Friedman, the economist, came up with a lot of school choice models and charter schools, these independent public schools that are designed to break the mold from the sort of the stagnation and decline that we've witnessed. But another state, my state, Massachusetts, in 1993 had former Governor Bill Weld, a pretty moderate to liberal Republican, and Tom Birmingham, a liberal Democrat who became the Senate president, Mark Roosevelt, who was the great-great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, got together. Republicans and Democrats worked together for what they called the grand bargain, the grand compromise. And what they did is they decided to put in a commitment to about $100 billion of state and local money in exchange for all of the hard things that people in public education never really wanted to do. First and foremost, they moved away from a lot of the fads that had been populating public education and I think led to the decline, and they moved in a direction towards a back-to-basics commitment to academic standards in English and math and science and history. They joined those standards with a high-stakes graduation test called MCAS that students needed to pass in order to graduate from high school because they thought it was particularly important that the high school diploma meant something. They augmented that with a teacher test. So any new teachers coming into the system not only had to have a test on how to teach, but also the substance of what's taught. So the same kind of academic standards that students were experiencing in the classroom and being tested on, the teachers were also being tested on. And we call that sort of the golden triangle of the success that Massachusetts has enjoyed. But some of the specifics of what was in those standards are important because a lot of the work that was done in the 90s and the early 2000s has led to really historic gains. And what were in those Massachusetts standards, and Sandy Stotsky, who oversaw the development, can tell you a little bit more detail. But in a nutshell, it required a great deal more classic literature, poetry, drama, the higher quality vocabulary that children need to succeed throughout their schooling, but particularly in higher education and for the rest of their lives. In mathematics, they borrowed or observed from some of the best experts in the world. Wilfred Schmidt, a mathematician from Harvard, who had a keen interest in K-12 education, worked on the math standards with Sandy. And they observed that having Algebra 1 as a gateway course in the 8th grade was what all the high-performing countries in the world do. So Massachusetts emulated the commitment to classical and the commitment to Algebra 1 by 8th grade.
Crop TV.